There are few scenes more iconic in the world of cinema than the ending of Seven. Few moments are met with the level of shock that this one creates. Because just when it seems like John Doe has finally been caught, that all of this will finally be behind Somerset and Mills, then comes the appearance of a box that will change the landscape of cinema. The look of pure devastation on Mills's face as he figures out exactly what's in the box.
What's in the box?
There's a reason this is considered one of the greatest of all time. So we're getting into how this ending was almost changed, the actors originally intended to play the detectives, and a hell of a lot more as we tell you what happened to David Fincher's Seven.
Whatever you hear, stay away. John Doe has the upper hand.
New York City used to be a very different place than it is currently. While Times Square is a hotspot for New Year's Eve and advertisements, back then it was a place for porno shops and junkies. While working as a sales assistant at Tower Records, Andrew Kevin Walker started working on his spec script. Inspired by his time in New York City, he credits the depressing town for being his main inspiration for the story, even going as far as to say that, if I hadn't lived there, I probably wouldn't have written Seven. Well, thank God that he did. At the time, studios were interested in very high-concept scripts, and Walker felt that he could come up with something intriguing. So he wrote a story about police officers pursuing a serial killer that uses the 7 deadly sins to dictate his crimes. Often while walking around New York, he would find himself transfixed on people who were openly sinning on street corners. He imagined a person who would fixate on these sins and want to punish those committing them. He wanted audiences to feel shocked and violated by the time the credits rolled. Walker was able to option the spec script to Italian company Penta Film. Penta then hired director Jeremiah S. Chechik, fresh off his success from National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. Chechik found himself wanting to direct more serious fare, so this was the perfect project. Only Penta and Chechik were insistent on changing the script, as well as the incredibly bleak ending. So getting rid of
What's in the box?
Walker set out to change his perfect ending. Making it decidedly more Hollywood, the new ending would be set in a church, on fire around them. In this version, the killer, John Doe, embodies envy and shoots one of the detectives dead, in turn being shot himself. And instead of winding up in a box, the detective's wife leaves the city in anguish. But this still wasn't enough, and the studio requested a total of 13 rewrites. Fearing being replaced, Walker acquiesced and completed the drafts. Fortunately for him, and cinemagoers worldwide, Penta Film went bankrupt and had to sell the rights to producer Arnold Kopelson, who would then in turn sell it to New Line Cinema. Chechik would then leave the project, and Guillermo del Toro was even approached to replace him. After his experience on Alien 3, David Fincher vowed to never make another movie again. But that changed when his agent sent him the script for Seven, absolutely transfixed on the slow reveal of John Doe's ultimate plan and its exploration of true evil. And the studio was horrified to discover that Fincher had been sent the original draft, and not the more Hollywooded version. After a bit of back and forth, and New Line president Michael DeLuca also having a preference for the original screenplay, it was decided to go forward with the more bleak ending. But the ending was a constant struggle with the studio, with them changing their mind all the time. They would only slightly back off once major A-list actors signed on, but that was more by force than anything. In fact, Brad Pitt, who had been cast as Detective Mills, only signed on with the condition that the ending not be changed. He felt that Mills needed to be the one that kills John Doe, and that Tracy had to die. Pitt was paranoid after the ending of Legends of the Fall had been changed after negative test screenings. But Fincher took a bit of convincing when it came to the casting of Pitt, as Brad had just been coming off of Interview with the Vampire and didn't fit what he imagined for the character. But after meeting the actor, Fincher knew that he had his man. Pitt was such a big get for the film that they shorted the pre-production period from 12 weeks down to 5 in order to accommodate Pitt's busy schedule. For Mills' wife Tracy, Robin Wright auditioned for the part, Christina Applegate actually turned it down before Pitt made the recommendation to take a look at Gwyneth Paltrow. The tone of the script turned Paltrow off, but ultimately, the fact that Tracy would be the film's only real positive element helped convince her. It probably didn't hurt that Pitt went to bat for her, and the two had such chemistry that they started dating while on set, and for several years after. Al Pacino, Gene Hackman, and Robert Duvall all turned down the role of Detective Somerset. While Walker had wrote the character with William Hurt in mind, Fincher ultimately cast Morgan Freeman in the role. Freeman is perfect as the detective who has clearly been around the block a few times. His reserved nature makes for a nice contrast between he and Mills, and his love for fine literature makes him stand out from other fictional police officers of the time. Casting is important for any movie, but there's an added pressure when it comes to casting a killer like John Doe. The filmmakers wanted this man to represent true evil. As such, they took inspiration from old police sketches of the Zodiac Killer, thinking that Ned Beatty actually bore a resemblance, as well as his fantastic filmography. Beatty was actually offered the part, but he turned it down, claiming that the script was the most evil thing that he'd ever read. Damn, put that on the poster. REM frontman Michael Stipe and Val Kilmer were considered as well. Pitt wanted Kevin Spacey for the part, but the studio refused to pay his salary. The filmmakers even went as far as to film the John Doe scenes with an unknown actor. But dailies proved that they really needed someone with presence, and they negotiated to get Spacey on board. The filmmakers would then hide Spacey's involvement to make his appearance all the more impactful. Because of this, Spacey is the first name that we see when the credits roll at the end.
If we catch John Doe and he turns out to be the devil, if he's Satan himself, that might live up to our expectations, but he's not the devil. He's just a man.
The story of Seven follows Detective William Somerset, who is near retirement, and working with his freshly transferred partner, David Mills, on a case. Somerset and Mills are like water and oil, and take drastically different approaches to the case, as well as life itself. But they start to bond as they try to catch the serial killer behind a series of strange murders. Each death is somehow connected to the 7 deadly sins. For those unaware, the 7 sins include pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. Filming on Seven started in December of '94. Despite the New York inspiration, the bulk of filming took place in Los Angeles, and while the city is often lacking in water, the production found itself constantly being rained on. But Fincher just made this part of the story, and it further hides the LA setting. He also avoided removable walls for the sets, wanting the crew to have to deal with limitations, and therefore ground the camera work in the reality of the set. Darius Conde was brought aboard as the cinematographer, and he looked to attain a heightened sense of realism within the frame. He utilized the entire frame and shallow depth of field, and was very particular about the amount of light. Because of this, the studio was very unhappy when they saw the dailies, saying that the film was far too dark. Thankfully, Fincher refused to compromise, as the darker look was what he wanted. He'd always hated when a film would say that a character couldn't see anything, while showing us that he clearly can. So Fincher wanted total darkness when flashlights were being used, and it's a brilliant effect. Filming was anything but easy, with Pitt slipping on the hood of a taxi during the John Doe pursuit scene. He cut tendons in his hand and had to be stitched up. If you look closely, you can see his cast in various scenes, which they accounted for during the rest of the filming schedule. During the moment where the sloth victim is found, Fincher told the SWAT actors that they would simply be coming upon a corpse. So imagine their surprise when the corpse came to life and gave them quite the startle. Oh, Fincher, you prankster. Rob Bottin, who famously did the practical effects for John Carpenter's The Thing, would create the effects for this film. He studied various crime scene photos and evidence files in order to get the most realistic interpretation, whether it's the gluttony victim buried in food or the sloth victim completely emaciated. These are moments that you won't soon forget. Executives turned to test screenings to see what the perception of the film would be. Despite its placement in cinema history as one of the greatest films of all time, that wasn't always the case, as test audiences were left unimpressed. This can probably be attributed to the fact that most audiences only went in with the knowledge that the film starred Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt, two actors who usually appeared in vastly different films from the tone of Seven. This made New Line quite trepidatious when it came to the film's release, and decided to focus the marketing mostly on the 7 deadly sins in an effort to promote the film. And they still weren't convinced of that ending. Suggestions were made to make Somerset Doe's killer, or have the head of one of Mills's dogs in the box versus Tracy's. Anything to somewhat brighten up the ending. You know, because people love animals getting killed than stuffed in a box. Heh. But Fincher and Pitt absolutely refused to budge on their ideals. And this worked out, as the scene, and how it's executed, makes for the perfect culmination of the prior 2 hours. In order to get the film ready to screen for studio execs, Kyle Cooper was hired to create a title sequence that was meant to reflect John Doe's perspective. We'd see glimpses of his notebooks, as well as him cutting off his fingerprints, and it sets up the mood of the film perfectly. Execs loved it so much that they wanted it in the final cut. But Fincher, being very against studio notes after his experience on Alien 3, didn't want to acquiesce, so he requested it be more elaborate. So Cooper took 8 days and filmed the sequence for just $50,000, giving us one of the most memorable title scenes out there.
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our JoBlo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
Realize, Detective, the only reason that I'm here right now is that I wanted to be.
Seven released in the United States on September 22, 1995, and brought in over $14 million on its opening weekend. It would end its worldwide run at over $327 million, being one of the biggest hits of the year. The film was universally praised by critics and audiences alike, earning an 83% and 95% fresh rating respectively. The critical consensus was that the movie was a brutal, relentlessly grimy shocker, with taut performances, slick gore effects, and a haunting finale. In the time since its release, there have been many imitators, but none have been quite able to recapture the magic that Fincher and company did back in 1995. We were recently fortunate enough to finally receive the film on 4K with a remaster supervised by Fincher himself. And while there's always some cause for concern with a 4K release, especially after what Cameron did to his movies, but Fincher has kept the film's essence intact. I'm not sure I agree with his choice to turn Mills's gun at the end into a flashlight, but just kidding. Can you imagine? New Line actually was going to make a sequel, aptly titled 8, which would see Somerset attain psychic abilities. Ugh. Thankfully, the 7 filmmakers were very against this idea, with Fincher eloquently stating that I would be less interested in that than I would in having cigarettes put out in my eyes. Ouch. Thankfully, that sequel never came to fruition, and 7 remains one of Fincher's crowning achievements, and one of the greatest serial killer thrillers of all time. Its ending reverberates throughout the Cinematic Hall of Fame, and has the same impact now that it did 30 years ago. As Ernest Hemingway once wrote, "The world is a fine place, and worth fighting for."
I agree with the second part.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. JoBlo remains an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support.